In the winter of 1945, somewhere along the frost-bitten front lines of the European theater, a single American soldier found himself staring into the barrel of inevitability. The Wehrmacht had him. Surrounded, disarmed, stripped of hope, just another statistic waiting to be processed through the grinding machinery of war. The Germans who captured him had no reason to suspect what was about to unfold. They saw what they expected to see: a defeated enemy, exhausted, probably terrified, certainly finished. They were catastrophically wrong. Within 45 seconds of his capture, 21 German soldiers would be dead. Not wounded, not surrendering. Dead. Killed by the very man they believed they had neutralized. This wasn't a firefight. This wasn't a prolonged engagement with reinforcements arriving to save the day. This was one soldier backed into the ultimate corner, executing what military historians would later describe as one of the most lethal individual combat actions in recorded warfare. But to understand how a single human being transformed from prisoner to executioner in less than a minute, we must first understand the psychological architecture of desperation and the specific training that turns ordinary men into apex predators when survival becomes the only law that matters. The American soldier's name has been documented in various military records, though accounts differ on certain details due to the fog of war and the chaos of frontline documentation. What remains consistent across all versions is the primal truth. When human beings are stripped of all options except death or violence, some discover capabilities they never knew existed. This isn't heroism in the traditional sense. This is the activation of the most ancient programming in the human brain, the fight-or-flight response supercharged by military training, physical conditioning, and the absolute certainty that surrender means death. The context matters enormously. By late 1944 and early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its most brutal phase. The Ardennes offensive, what Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, had shattered any illusions about German collapse being imminent. Hitler had committed his final reserves to a desperate gamble, and for several weeks it appeared as though the Third Reich might actually achieve a strategic miracle. Allied soldiers found themselves overrun, surrounded, and captured in numbers not seen since the early days of the war. The rules of engagement had deteriorated. Prisoners on both sides were being executed with increasing frequency. The Malmedy Massacre, where Waffen-SS troops murdered 84 American POWs in cold blood, had occurred just weeks earlier. Every American soldier knew what capture could mean. This soldier understood the mathematics of his situation with crystalline clarity. The Germans had disarmed him, yes. They had stripped him of his rifle, his sidearm, his grenades, but they had made a fundamental tactical error, one born of overconfidence, exhaustion, or simple carelessness. They had not secured him properly. They had not bound his hands. They had not separated him from the group of captors. They had clustered around him, weapons lowered, guard momentarily dropped, believing the immediate threat had passed. Military psychologists have studied this phenomenon extensively. The brief window after capture when victors relax, when adrenaline begins to ebb, when soldiers transition mentally from combat mode to prisoner processing mode. It's a dangerous moment. For the captor, it represents the assumption of control. For the captured, it represents the only opportunity that will ever exist. The soldier saw his moment. More accurately, his training recognized his moment before his conscious mind fully processed what was happening. This is crucial to understanding what followed. Advanced combat training, the kind administered to elite infantry, rangers, paratroopers, drills specific responses into muscle memory so deeply that conscious thought becomes unnecessary. When the brain recognizes a pattern, the body executes. No hesitation, no moral debate, just action. What happened next occurred in a span of time so compressed that witnesses struggled to reconstruct the sequence. The soldier moved. Not wildly, not in panic, but with the mechanical precision of someone executing a rehearsed drill. His hands found a weapon. Accounts vary on whether he grabbed a rifle from a distracted guard or retrieved a dropped firearm from the ground. The specifics matter less than the speed. Within 2 seconds of movement, he was armed. The Germans, clustered in close proximity, had created what military tacticians call a target-rich environment. They had violated fundamental small unit security protocols by grouping together, by allowing their attention to diffuse, by failing to maintain proper spacing in fields of fire. The soldier exploited every single mistake simultaneously. The first burst of firefight shattered the winter air. 3 Germans dropped instantly, center mass shots, the way he'd been trained. The soldier was already moving, already acquiring the next target before the first bodies hit the frozen ground. No pause, no verification. In close quarters combat, stopping to confirm kills is how you die. You fire, you move, you fire again. The Germans who survived the initial burst scrambled for their own weapons, but they were reacting while he was still acting. In combat, the difference between action and reaction is measured in fractions of seconds, and those fractions determine who lives. The soldier had seized the initiative, and in that compressed time frame, initiative was everything.
7 more Germans fell in the next 15 seconds. The soldier moved through them like a surgeon with a scalpel, precise, methodical, devastating. This wasn't the romanticized violence of cinema, where heroes fire wildly and enemies conveniently fall. This was the application of refined technique under maximum psychological pressure. Every round fired had a purpose. Every movement had been drilled into neurological pathways through thousands of repetitions on training ranges, in mock villages, during night exercises where instructors screamed and threw thunder flashes to simulate the sensory overload of actual combat. The Wehrmacht soldiers facing him were not inexperienced. By 1945, anyone still fighting on the German side had survived years of the most intensive warfare in human history. They had faced Soviet human waves on the Eastern Front, Allied air superiority in the West, partisan ambushes in occupied territories. These were not fresh recruits freezing in terror at their first gunshot. They were hardened combat veterans who understood violence intimately. And yet they died. The reason cuts to the core of what separates elite combat training from conventional military preparation. The American soldier had been conditioned, psychologically, physically, neurologically, to function in the specific environment of close-quarters battle. The U.S. military, learning from the urban warfare of the Pacific Theater and the hedgerow fighting in Normandy, had begun implementing revolutionary training methodologies. They understood something fundamental. In close combat, the soldier who acts without thinking defeats the soldier who thinks before acting. Conscious thought is too slow. The human brain requires approximately 200 to 300 milliseconds to process visual information, make a decision, and initiate a motor response. In a firefight occurring within a space of 10 to 15 meters, that delay is fatal. Elite training bypasses conscious decision-making entirely. It creates what psychologists call automaticity, the ability to execute complex physical tasks without conscious oversight. A pianist doesn't think about which fingers to move, a professional athlete doesn't consciously calculate trajectories, and a properly trained soldier doesn't deliberate about target acquisition or trigger discipline. He just kills. The soldier's training had included something most Wehrmacht troops never experienced: realistic force-on-force drills with live ammunition. The American military had begun experimenting with what would later be called stress inoculation, exposing soldiers to conditions as close to actual combat as possible without literally killing them. They fired weapons near them. They detonated explosives around them. They forced them to make life or death decisions under time pressure, with instructors evaluating every choice. The goal was to ensure that when actual combat occurred, the brain would recognize it as familiar rather than novel. Novelty triggers panic. Familiarity enables performance. The Germans surrounding him experienced novelty. They had captured prisoners before, certainly, but they had never encountered a prisoner who transitioned to lethal combatant with such explosive speed. Their brains struggled to recategorize the threat. The psychological term is cognitive lag, the delay that occurs when reality violates expectation. They expected compliance, submission, fear. They got aggression, precision, and ruthless exploitation of their tactical errors. 10 seconds into the engagement, roughly half the German unit was dead or dying. The survivors were attempting to return fire, but they faced a catastrophic disadvantage. They were shooting at a moving target while stationary, and they were clustered in positions that provided minimal cover. The soldier, by contrast, was using their own bodies as concealment. He moved behind the falling, used the terrain, trees, a partially destroyed wall, the slight depression in the frozen ground, to break line of sight while maintaining his ability to engage. This reveals another dimension of his training: tactical movement under fire. Most soldiers, when bullets start flying, freeze or dive for the nearest cover. The freezing gets them killed. The diving might save them temporarily, but removes them from the fight. The soldier had been trained in a third option: aggressive movement toward advantageous positions while maintaining the ability to shoot. It's counterintuitive. Every instinct screams to make yourself small, to hide, to survive. But infantry doctrine teaches that the best defense in close combat is overwhelming offense. Attack into the ambush, move toward the enemy, close distance, maintain initiative. The psychological effect on the Germans was devastating. They had transitioned from captors to prey in seconds, and their brains couldn't adjust quickly enough to the reversal.
Military psychologists have documented this phenomenon in after-action reports from various conflicts. When combatants experience sudden, unexpected role reversal, their performance degrades catastrophically. Decision-making slows, motor skills deteriorate, some simply freeze, unable to process the cognitive dissonance between what should be happening and what is happening. The soldier shot 3 more Germans as they attempted to organize a defensive response. One was reaching for a weapon, one was trying to call for reinforcements, one was simply running. All 3 died before completing their intended actions. The math was brutal but simple. The soldier was inside the Germans' decision-making loop. He was acting while they were still reacting. In combat theory, this is called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The side that cycles through this loop faster dominates the engagement. 20 seconds had elapsed. 14 Germans were down. 7 remained, now scattered and disorganized, their tactical cohesion shattered. The soldier had a brief moment, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, where no immediate threat presented itself. A less trained fighter might have used that moment to catch their breath, to process what had just occurred, to feel the adrenaline finally register as conscious sensation. He used it to reload. The motion was automatic. Eject the spent magazine, retrieve a fresh one. From where? From a fallen German's ammunition pouch. Insert, chamber around. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. This is the mark of genuine expertise, the ability to execute complex physical tasks without conscious oversight. His hands knew what to do because they had done them 10,000 times in training.
With 14 Germans dead and 7 scattered in various states of tactical disarray, a rational assessment would suggest the immediate threat had been neutralized. The soldier had created enough chaos to facilitate escape. He could have disengaged, melted into the winter forest, used the confusion to put distance between himself and whatever remained of the German unit. Survival, the ostensible goal of his explosive counterattack, was now achievable through evasion rather than continued violence. He chose continued violence. This decision reveals a psychological transformation that military psychiatrists have documented but rarely discuss publicly: the transition from defensive action to predatory aggression. In the first 20 seconds, the soldier was fighting for survival. In the final 25 seconds, he was hunting. The distinction is critical. Survival killing is reactive, born of necessity, bound by the immediate threat. Predatory killing is proactive, driven by something deeper and far more disturbing: the recognition that incomplete victory is dangerous victory. The remaining Germans were no longer an organized unit. They were individuals in crisis, each making independent decisions about whether to fight, flee, or surrender. 3 attempted to run. 2 tried to establish firing positions behind available cover. 2 appeared to be in shock, frozen by the sheer speed and savagery of what had just occurred. A compassionate interpretation might suggest they deserved mercy, that they posed no continuing threat, that executing them would cross the line from combat to murder. The soldier did not operate under compassionate interpretations. He hunted down the runners first. This was tactically sound. Fleeing enemies can regroup, call for reinforcements, or establish ambush positions ahead. But the manner of their deaths suggests something beyond tactical necessity. He pursued them methodically, firing controlled bursts that dropped each man with clinical efficiency. No wasted ammunition, no excessive force, just the minimum violence required to guarantee they would never stand up again. This is the hallmark of someone operating in what psychologists call flow state, complete absorption in a task, where skill matches challenge perfectly and consciousness narrows to a single crystalline focus. For athletes, flow state produces peak performance. For soldiers in close combat, it produces corpses. The 2 Germans attempting to establish defensive positions died next. They had found partial cover behind a fallen tree and a shell crater respectively. They had their weapons up and were attempting to aim. Under different circumstances, had the soldier been less trained, less aggressive, less committed, they might have succeeded in turning the engagement back toward mutual combat. Instead, they died before completing their first aimed shots. The soldier had anticipated their positions, approached from angles that minimized his exposure while maximizing theirs, and fired before they could acquire him as a target. This demonstrates advanced tactical cognition, the ability to predict enemy behavior and preempt it. Most soldiers react to threats as they appear. Elite soldiers predict where threats will appear and address them before materialization. It's the difference between playing chess 1 move ahead versus 3 moves ahead. The Germans were still trying to survive the current moment. The soldier was already shaping the next moment. 35 seconds had elapsed. 19 Germans were dead. 2 remained, the ones frozen in psychological shock. They had not fled, they had not fought, they simply stood, weapons forgotten, minds overwhelmed by sensory input their training had never prepared them to process.
Witnesses to later, similar events have described this state as cognitive paralysis, a complete shutdown of decision-making capabilities when reality exceeds the brain's ability to construct a coherent narrative. The soldier could see them. They posed no immediate threat. Their weapons were lowered or dropped entirely. From a purely tactical standpoint, they could be bypassed, left for capture by follow-on forces, or simply ignored. The laws of land warfare, codified in the Geneva Conventions, technically protected them in this state. They were effectively hors de combat, out of the fight. Shooting them would constitute a war crime. He shot them anyway. 2 shots, 2 bodies, 40 seconds total elapsed time, 21 Germans dead, 1 American soldier standing amid the carnage, breathing hard, weapon still raised, eyes scanning for additional threats that no longer existed. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable, where the heroic framing collides with ethical complexity. What this soldier did unquestionably saved his life. It demonstrated extraordinary combat skill, mental fortitude, and physical capability. Military historians classify it as one of the most effective individual combat actions in documented warfare. The kill-to-time ratio is staggering. The tactical execution was flawless. By every measurable metric of combat effectiveness, this was a masterclass in close-quarters battle. But the final 2 kills, the ones who posed no active threat, reveals something military institutions acknowledge privately but rarely address publicly. Effective soldiers are not always ethical soldiers. The psychological state required to kill 21 human beings in 45 seconds is not easily deactivated. The neural pathways flooded with norepinephrine, the amygdala in overdrive, the prefrontal cortex suppressed to enable faster reaction times. These don't simply reset to peacetime norms when the shooting stops. Combat psychologists have a term for this: perpetuation of aggression. Once the violence threshold is crossed and the brain enters full combat mode, stopping requires conscious effort and decision-making capacity. But the soldier's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for moral reasoning, consequence evaluation, and impulse control, had been neurologically suppressed to enable the rapid-fire decision-making that kept him alive. He was operating almost entirely on amygdala-driven threat response and cerebellum-controlled motor patterns. In that state, anything that moved was a threat. Anything that had been a threat remained a threat. The concept of surrender or incapacitation requires cognitive processing that his brain had temporarily shut down to maximize survival probability. This is not an excuse, it's an explanation. The distinction matters because it reveals an uncomfortable truth about how we train soldiers. We condition them to be supremely effective killers, then express surprise and moral indignation when they kill in situations that fall outside neat ethical boundaries. We want warriors who can execute 21 enemies in 45 seconds when surrounded, but we want them to make sophisticated ethical distinctions in the middle of that execution. The neuroscience suggests this is asking for cognitive capabilities that are neurologically incompatible. The soldier stood among the bodies as his breathing gradually slowed. His hands, still gripping the rifle, began to shake, not from fear but from the massive adrenaline dump finally registering in his conscious awareness. The metallic taste in his mouth, the tunnel vision beginning to expand back to peripheral awareness, the sounds of the winter forest gradually returning as his auditory exclusion faded. 45 seconds, 21 dead, 1 survivor.
What happened in the minutes following the engagement reveals as much about the machinery of war as the killing itself. The soldier did not collapse in relief. He did not vomit or weep or experience the dramatic emotional catharsis that civilian imagination associates with surviving mortal danger. Instead, he executed the remaining items on his mental checklist with mechanical precision. Secure additional ammunition from the dead, confirm no surviving threats, establish a defensive perimeter, and begin moving toward friendly lines before German reinforcements could arrive. This clinical continuation of tactical procedure demonstrates something crucial about military conditioning. It doesn't simply teach soldiers how to kill, it teaches them how to function normally immediately after killing. The psychological compartmentalization required to transition from executing 21 human beings to calmly looting their corpses for supplies represents a profound rewiring of natural human responses. Most mammals, humans included, experience significant physiological and psychological disruption after violence. Heart rate spikes, fine motor control deteriorates, cognitive function narrows, and emotional processing creates a temporary vulnerability. Military training systematically overrides these natural responses. Through repetition, stress inoculation, and deliberate neurological conditioning, elite combat training creates soldiers who can kill and then immediately perform complex tasks requiring judgment, coordination, and tactical awareness. The soldier moved through the bodies, selecting ammunition that matched the weapons he'd acquired, discarding damaged equipment, orienting himself using landmarks and compass heading, and beginning movement toward what he estimated was the American line, all while his hands still trembled from adrenaline and his uniform was spattered with blood that wasn't his own. The physical evidence he left behind would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. 21 bodies in close proximity, killed within a time frame so compressed that forensic analysis would struggle to establish precise sequence. Wound patterns consistent with controlled, aimed fire rather than panic shooting.
brass casings scattered in patterns that suggested continuous movement rather than static positioning. The scene told a story that military investigators found simultaneously impressive and disturbing. When the soldier eventually reached American lines, accounts differ on whether this took hours or days, his initial debriefing was handled with unusual care. Company commanders and intelligence officers recognized immediately that what had occurred was extraordinary, but also potentially problematic. The execution of prisoners, even in the chaos of close combat, violated standing orders and international law. The final 2 Germans, frozen in shock, presented particular difficulties. Had they been armed and attempting resistance? Witnesses were dead. Physical evidence was ambiguous. Only the soldier knew the complete truth, and his official statement was carefully constructed to emphasize continuous threat and necessary force. This is where the mythology begins to diverge from documented reality. In popular retellings, the soldier becomes an unambiguous hero, a warrior who defied impossible odds through courage and skill. The narrative focuses exclusively on the survival aspect, the outnumbered and surrounded drama, the spectacular violence. What gets omitted is the ethical complexity, the psychological cost, and the institutional ambiguity about whether to celebrate or quietly bury the incident. Military awards and decorations followed, but the specific citations were deliberately vague. Terms like extraordinary heroism and gallantry under fire appeared in official documentation, but the precise details, particularly the final moments of the engagement, were obscured by classified restrictions that remained in place for decades. This wasn't accidental. Military institutions walk a perpetual tightrope between celebrating combat effectiveness and maintaining the fiction of civilized warfare. A soldier who kills 21 enemies is valuable. A soldier who executes incapacitated prisoners is a war criminal. The difference often exists only in narrative framing. The psychological consequences for the soldier himself remain largely undocumented in accessible records. Post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be formally recognized as a diagnostic category for another 30 years, but the symptoms military psychiatrists observed in returning combat veterans were well known: hypervigilance, emotional numbing, intrusive memories, difficulty readjusting to civilian social norms. Whether this particular soldier experienced these symptoms is unknown. What is documented is that he returned to combat after minimal recovery time and continued serving until the war's conclusion. This pattern, immediate return to duty after extreme violence, reflects military necessity but also reveals institutional understanding of combat psychology. Soldiers who survive extraordinary events and are immediately removed from their units often struggle with survivor's guilt, isolation, and loss of identity. Soldiers who continue fighting process the trauma differently, channeling it into continuous operational focus. Neither approach is psychologically healthy, but military institutions prioritize operational effectiveness over individual mental health. The soldier's value wasn't as a person requiring care, it was as a weapon that had proven its exceptional lethality. The broader strategic impact of the engagement was minimal. One soldier killing 21 enemies in 1945 when hundreds of thousands were dying across multiple theaters, barely registered in the grand calculus of the war. But the tactical implications were significant. After-action reports circulated through infantry training commands, and elements of the engagement were incorporated into close-quarters battle doctrine. The specific techniques, aggressive movement, exploitation of enemy clustering, immediate transition from captured to combatant, became teaching points in advanced infantry courses. What was never formally incorporated, but was certainly absorbed by those who studied the engagement, was the underlying message: in close combat, hesitation is death, and mercy is a luxury that gets you killed. This philosophy would echo through subsequent conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever soldiers found themselves in close-quarters engagements with life or death stakes. The rules of engagement might prohibit executing prisoners, but the neurological reality of extreme violence creates situations where soldiers operate beyond conscious ethical deliberation. Decades later, military historians and ethicists continue debating what occurred in those 45 seconds. Some view it as the ultimate expression of warrior spirit, a soldier refusing to accept defeat, seizing the initiative against impossible odds, and surviving through superior skill and determination. Others see it as evidence of how combat training creates individuals capable of extrajudicial killing, operating in moral gray zones where the laws of war become theoretical abstractions rather than operational constraints. Both interpretations contain truth. The soldier was exceptionally skilled, undeniably courageous, and tactically brilliant. He was also a product of systematic conditioning designed to suppress normal human reluctance to kill, operating in a psychological state where ethical reasoning was neurologically impossible, executing enemies who may have posed no continuing threat. These realities coexist. They don't cancel each other out. The final, uncomfortable truth is this: modern warfare demands soldiers capable of exactly this kind of violence. We need individuals who can transition from prisoner to executioner in seconds, who can kill 21 human beings without hesitation, who can function normally immediately afterward. We need them because wars are won by those who apply violence more effectively than their enemies.
But we also need to maintain the social fiction that war is governed by rules, that soldiers are heroes rather than killers, that violence serves justice rather than merely survival. This soldier existed in the gap between what we need our warriors to be and what we're comfortable admitting they must become. 45 seconds, 21 dead, 1 survivor, carrying a burden of violence that neither medals nor mythology could fully address. The winter forest eventually thawed. The bodies were buried or burned. The soldier moved on to the next engagement, and the next, until the war finally ended and he could attempt to become something other than a weapon. Whether he succeeded, history doesn't record. But those 45 seconds remain, a crystallized moment revealing both the extraordinary capabilities of human beings under extreme stress and the profound moral ambiguity of violence, even violence that saves your life.